I spent a good portion of my early adult life camping in strange places, though I wouldn't have called it camping at the time. Out in the field, with an LMTV parked nearby, sleeping in a tent or under the open sky, we called it training. But looking back, those nights out there were camping in every sense of the word, just without the luxury of picking the location or packing what you wanted. And what always stuck with me more than the drills, more than the rucking, more than the endless hours of waiting, were the animals that seemed to haunt military bases. I swear animals on bases are different from the ones you'd find anywhere else. It wasn't just the sheer numbers, though there were plenty. It was how bold they were, how completely unafraid they seemed. Civilian deer would bolt at the first hint of a human stepping out of the treeline. Civilian raccoons, for the most part, would keep their distance, sneaking around only when they were sure you weren't looking. But on base, it was like the rules of nature had been rewritten. These animals had adapted to life among thousands of young men and women stomping around in boots, running drills, dropping half-eaten MREs on the ground, and leaving scraps scattered in trash pits. They knew exactly what they could get away with, and they knew we couldn't do a damn thing about it. The deer were the first ones I noticed. I remember standing in formation early in the morning, fog still hanging low over the open fields, when I saw two big does just strolling along the tree line. They weren't even trying to be sneaky. They didn't flinch when the drill sergeants barked at us. They didn't scatter when a convoy of trucks rolled past. They just walked with this quiet arrogance, like they knew we weren't going to touch them. And they were right. Regulations kept us from messing with them, and somehow they seemed to understand that. They moved with total impunity, sometimes even cutting across the gravel roads right in front of us. I'd see bucks too, standing broadside at the edge of the woods, staring with their heads high, antlers catching the first bit of daylight. They looked almost smug, like kings surveying a kingdom. But the deer were just part of the picture. The raccoons were something else entirely. Most raccoons I'd seen before joining were cautious little things. They'd come out at night to knock over garbage cans in neighborhoods, skittering away the second a porch light flicked on. On base, though, they were like another breed. Bigger, bolder, smarter. They weren't scared of noise, of lights, of people shouting. They knew that inside those green packs and cardboard boxes we hauled around were treasures, and they wanted them. It was like dealing with a pack of professional thieves that just happened to have fur and little black masks built into their faces. The first time I realized how far they'd go was during a long field exercise. We'd been out for days, bone-tired, barely keeping ourselves moving through the motions of whatever task was at hand. At night, we'd collapse under ponchos or curl up against our rucks, boots still laced, rifles always close. The LMTVs sat parked at the edge of the training area, their canvas backs loaded with boxes of MREs and gear that wasn't immediately needed. It was quiet, one of those nights where the air felt too still, too heavy. The moon was out, but a haze dulled it, making everything feel dim and gray. I was half awake, drifting in that thin line between sleep and alertness, when I heard something. Not boots, not voices, but this soft rustling, the sound of fabric shifting and claws scraping on metal. I thought maybe it was someone sneaking a snack, but then came a low thud, followed by the faint creak of canvas stretching. I sat up, rubbing the blur from my eyes, and stared toward the row of trucks. At first, I couldn't make sense of it, just dark shapes moving against darker shadows. Then I caught the gleam of eyes, several pairs, shining back at me like tiny mirrors. There were raccoons, at least 4 of them, climbing up into the back of an LMTV. They moved quick, working together like a practiced crew. One would jump onto the tailgate, another would scurry up the side using the ropes that tied the canvas down, and the others followed right behind. The flap at the back had been left loosely tied, probably from someone being careless, and the animals slipped right through the gap. I could hear them inside, claws clicking on metal flooring, cardboard tearing. I didn't move. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but another part of me just watched in this weird unease, because the way they operated didn't feel like random animal scavenging. They weren't stumbling around or sniffing at the edges. They were pulling things apart, dragging packs, shoving boxes. They knew exactly what they wanted, and they were taking it. That was when one of the drill sergeants stirred. He'd been stretched out in the back of a different truck, catching whatever sleep he could, and the noise must have woken him. There was this sudden burst of chaos, the sound of him shouting, scrambling upright, then the unmistakable cracks of blanks being fired. Muzzle flashes lit up the inside of the truck like a strobe, harsh bursts of light that silhouetted the raccoons as they leapt and scattered. I'll never forget the sight of them pouring out of the back of that LMTV, each one carrying something in its little paws. One had a torn open MRE pouch, another dragged an entire unopened box. Two more had packets clutched to their chests as they bounded down and disappeared into the tree line. The drill sergeant was left standing there, weapons still smoking from the blanks, looking half-crazed in the flashing shadows. The rest of us, jolted awake, just stared, stunned. Some tried to hide their laughter, others shook their heads. But me, I felt something else sitting heavy in my stomach. Amusement, yes, but also this strange, unsettled feeling. Those raccoons hadn't acted like scavengers caught in the act. They'd looked more like raiders, like they'd planned it, like they'd been watching us and waiting for the chance. And the way they bolted into the darkness with armfuls of food, not dropping a thing even with shots cracking around them, left me cold. The next day, we found the aftermath. Empty wrappers scattered in the woods just beyond camp. Torn up boxes, even a set of boot laces chewed halfway through, like one of them had gnawed on it for fun. The supply guys weren't happy, but there wasn't much they could do. You couldn't exactly patrol for raccoons, and traps weren't part of the plan. Everyone laughed it off, chalking it up as just another ridiculous field story. But for the rest of that exercise, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, when the camp went quiet, I'd catch faint rustles at the edge of the tree line. Sometimes I'd see eyeshine, just hovering there for minutes at a time, like they were waiting. I'd grip my rifle tight, knowing it wouldn't matter against animals like that, and eventually I'd drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep. By the time we rotated back to the barracks, the story had become legend. Everyone retold it, adding details, exaggerating, turning it into a joke. The image of raccoons sprinting off into the woods with stolen MREs became one of those things people would chuckle about months later. And yeah, I laughed too, but deep down, whenever I thought about it, I remembered the part no one else seemed to care about. The way they'd moved, the way they'd worked together, the way they'd shown no fear of us, even under gunfire. That was the night I realized something important. On military bases, it wasn't the drills or the long hikes or even the cold that got under my skin. It was the animals. They weren't like the ones I'd grown up with. They'd learned to thrive in our presence, to take advantage of every weakness. And as long as we were out there, they'd always be watching, waiting for the right moment. And though years have passed since then, whenever I see a raccoon in some neighborhood, sneaking around a trash bin, I can't help but think of that night. I remember the sound of claws tearing into canvas, the sudden flashes of blanks lighting up the back of a truck, and the surreal image of masked animals sprinting into the woods with our food clutched in their paws. It still makes me laugh in a way, but it also leaves me uneasy because I know what they're capable of when they've learned they don't have to fear you. That was the scariest part of all. Not that they stole from us, not even that they did it so well. It was knowing that in their own quiet way, they owned that place as much as we did. And out there in the dark, under the trees and stars, there was nothing we could do to stop them. I have camped enough times in strange places to know that the woods always hold something unexpected. But there are some things that stick in your mind years later, things you can't explain no matter how you try. One of those things for me will always be the night I found a backpack full of Skittles abandoned in a bathroom at a remote campsite. It sounds ridiculous even to write it out, like a half-baked story someone would share as a joke. But I lived it, and it still unsettles me in ways I can't quite shake. It was a late summer trip, one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions to get out of the city and into the quiet. The place I chose was a semi-maintained camping area, one of those spots far enough back that only four-wheel drive vehicles could really handle the approach. I liked it because it felt forgotten. There were a few fire pits scattered around, some rotten picnic tables that looked like they had been built decades ago and never replaced, and two outhouses that stood leaning against time, their wooden siding gray and warped. Park staff might have driven through once a year to check the place, but if they did, they didn't leave much sign of their presence. When I pulled in, The sun was starting its slow drop behind the tree line. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. It had rained a couple of days before, so the ground was soft, and the grass around the sites was high, brushing against my boots as I walked. There was no one else around. No other vehicles, no voices, no fires burning. Just silence, broken only by the occasional call of a bird echoing through the trees. I picked a site not far from the treeline, one with a half-collapsed picnic table and a fire pit that still held the char of old ashes. I unloaded slowly, setting up my tent, rolling out the sleeping pad, organizing my small pile of gear. The stillness was almost heavy, the kind that presses on your ears and makes every small sound you make feel too loud. I could hear the zippers of my tent, the metallic clink of my stove, the snap of twigs underfoot, all magnified in that quiet. Once camp was up, I decided to check the outhouses. They stood side by side on the edge of the clearing, tilted just slightly, doors closed but weathered from years of sun and rain. I wasn't expecting much. These kinds of bathrooms are always bad, usually half-rotting inside, sometimes worse. But they are also a necessity, especially if you're staying more than one night. I walked over, the grass brushing against my shins, and grabbed the handle of the first one. The door stuck for a second, swollen from humidity, then opened with a long creak. I braced myself for the smell, but what hit me first wasn't the usual sour stench. It was the sight. Against the back wall, sitting upright on the wooden floor, were 3 backpacks. Full-sized hiking packs, the kind you'd use for a week-long trip, each one zipped shut, straps neatly tucked. They didn't look abandoned in the way you expect in a place like that. They weren't ripped, chewed on, or thrown in a pile. They looked placed, carefully, side by side, almost like someone had set them there on purpose. My first thought was that someone was still camping nearby, that maybe I had missed another vehicle, but the lot was empty, the other sites untouched. I stepped inside and crouched down, staring at them. Curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped the first one slowly, expecting maybe old clothes, forgotten gear, something weather-damaged. Instead, I found well-packed camping supplies. A sleeping bag, a small stove, cookware, tarps, rope, all of it good quality, all of it organized. The second pack was more of the same: gear, clothing, food rations, all the basics someone would need to spend a serious amount of time out there. Then I opened the third. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. The bag was stuffed to the brim with candy. Skittles. Dozens of bags, small ones, family packs, bulk packs, regular, tropical, sour. Every kind of flavor and packaging you could think of, all jammed together tightly until the pack bulged. The smell of sugar was faint but undeniable, filling the small space of the outhouse. It was absurd, unsettling in its excess. 80 liters of candy, packed with the same care someone might use to store survival gear. I sat back on my heels and just stared at it. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a joke? Maybe some group had hauled it out here as a prank, abandoned it when they got tired of carrying the weight. Maybe it belonged to someone eccentric, someone with a strange obsession. But none of it felt right. Why here? Why in the back of a remote outhouse, where no one would stumble across it unless they opened the door? The air inside was stale, and I felt claustrophobic suddenly, so I backed out, pulling the door closed. I stood in the clearing with the evening light fading, my camp a few yards away, the silence pressing down again. The image of that pack full of Skittles clung to me, buzzing in my head like a fly that wouldn't leave. That night, I sat by my fire, the flames low, listening to the woods shift around me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed sharper, closer. I kept looking toward the outhouse, its dark shape barely visible through the trees. I couldn't stop thinking about the bags, sitting in there like they were waiting. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, ears tuned to every sound. I expected footsteps at any moment, someone coming to retrieve what I had seen. But the woods stayed empty, the night stretched on. When morning came, pale light filtering through the pines, I felt more tired than when I had lain down. I stayed 4 days in that camp. Each day I checked the site, looked for tracks, listened for signs of others. I saw no one. No tire marks, no footprints, no smoke from distant fires. The pack stayed exactly where they had been, untouched. It was as though they had been placed there and forgotten, sealed away in that outhouse like some kind of offering. By the last day, the sight of them filled me with unease. I wanted nothing to do with them. I packed my camp in silence, loaded the truck, and left without looking back at the outhouse. When I reached civilization again, I reported what I had found to the conservation officers, told them exactly where it was and what I saw. They wrote it down, nodded, said they would check. I never heard more. Even now, years later, I think about it. 3 backpacks, 2 filled with normal gear, 1 filled with nothing but candy. No people, no explanation, just sitting there in the woods, waiting. The image sticks with me because it doesn't make sense. In the wilderness, danger usually has a pattern. You can track storms, avoid predators, prepare for cold. But this was different. This was human strangeness, the kind you can't predict, the kind that makes the woods more unsettling than any storm. And that is the part that scared me most of all. Not the trees falling in a windstorm, not the drunk men firing guns near camp, not the sounds of animals in the night. Those things you can understand. But a backpack full of Skittles abandoned in a bathroom? That doesn't fit into any rule I know. It sits in my memory like an open question, and I don't think I'll ever have an answer. I don't think there's a more vulnerable feeling in the world than squatting in the woods with your pants around your ankles, trying to take care of business, when something out there in the trees decides to remind you that you're not the only living thing on the mountain. I found that out the hard way, and it's a memory I'll never forget. The trip itself had started off simple enough. I had been planning a solo weekend camping trip for weeks. One of those little escapes I give myself when the grind of work and people just wears me thin. I picked a spot that wasn't exactly remote wilderness, but it wasn't a walk in the park either. It was a couple miles up a trail that wound through scrub pines, steep rock shelves, and long grassy clearings that looked golden in the afternoon sun. I liked it because there was a stream nearby for water, enough flat space for a tent, and the nearest road was a good hike away. That always gave me a sense of peace. The silence, the separation, the idea that for a couple of nights, the world couldn't touch me. I had my gear packed light, just a 1-person tent, sleeping bag, a couple freeze-dried meals, a small propane stove, water filter, and the usual camp odds and ends. But one piece of gear I never left behind, not anymore, was my pistol. A lot of people think carrying a firearm in the woods is overkill, but I've seen enough sign of big predators over the years to know that accidents happen. I've seen fresh bear tracks in places I was sleeping, heard coyotes surround a campsite at night, and more than once had deer stomp into camp in the middle of the night like they owned the place. The gun wasn't for bravado, it was insurance. The hike in was hot and slow, but nothing out of the ordinary. My shoulders sweated under the straps of my pack, and the air smelled of pine sap and dry earth. I passed no one on the trail, which didn't surprise me given the spot I was headed for. When I got to camp, I set up in my usual spot near the tree line, where the ground dipped just enough to give some shelter from the wind but wasn't so low that rain would pool. The first evening was perfect, quiet, still, the kind of silence you can only get far from highways. I sat with my little stove, heating up a pouch of beef stew, and watched the sunset burn pink and orange over the ridge. By the time I zipped up in my bag, I felt like I had made the right choice coming out there. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke once at the sound of something moving outside my tent, but when I listened closer, it was just the faint rustle of a deer moving through the grass. By morning, the air was cool, crisp, the kind of temperature that makes coffee taste better than it has any right to. But by late morning, after breakfast and tidying up camp, I realized I needed to take care of something more personal. Out in the woods, you don't have the luxury of a bathroom. Usually, I'd go dig a cat hole a good ways away from camp, do my business and bury it properly. I had the trowel in my pack for that exact reason. But that morning, my stomach had been grumbling more insistently than usual, and I knew I couldn't stall it much longer. I grabbed my little roll of toilet paper, slung the pistol on my belt like I always did when I left camp, and walked down toward a cluster of trees maybe 100 yards out. I picked a spot behind some brush, out of sight from the trail and camp, and did the usual routine. cleared a patch, dug a quick hole, and crouched down. It's funny how exposed you feel in that position. No one likes it and no one talks about it, but every camper knows the weird anxiety that comes with it. You're literally at your most defenseless. Pants down, body stuck in an awkward squat, focus divided between nature's call and scanning the trees for any movement. Usually, the worst I expect is a squirrel darting by or a curious deer sniffing around. But that morning, as I looked up from the hole I was squatting over, I froze. About 100 feet away, half hidden in the shadow of a boulder, was a shape. At first I thought it was just a deer standing in a weird spot, but as my eyes adjusted, the truth hit me like a punch to the chest. It was a mountain lion. His coat was the color of dry grass, sleek and muscular. The head was low, the eyes fixed on me with a stillness that only predators carry. Its tail twitched once, slow, deliberate, like the tip of a whip being tested. I could see its chest rising and falling, steady, calm, as if it had all the time in the world to watch me. Every nerve in my body lit up at once. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the absurdity of my position. Pants around my ankles, crouched over a hole, completely exposed, only made the fear sharper. It wasn't just fear of the animal itself, it was fear of the vulnerability. I couldn't run, I couldn't fight. I was stuck in the most humiliating, dangerous posture possible with a predator sizing me up. The only thing that gave me a shred of reassurance was the pistol on my hip. I didn't want to reach for it too fast and trigger the cat's instinct, but just knowing it was there steadied me. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to finish quickly, heart pounding so hard it felt like the sound alone might give me away. I've never moved faster in my life. I wiped, yanked my pants back up with trembling hands, and clipped the holster shut. All the while, I never took my eyes off the cat. It didn't move closer, but it didn't back away either. It just stood there, watching, as if it was weighing the situation. Maybe it was curious, maybe it was considering me, or maybe it was just biding its time. I'll never know. When I finally stood upright, I slowly slid my hand to rest on the pistol grip. The cat's ears twitched, and for a second, I thought it was going to make its move. My chest tightened, and I steadied my stance. But after another long moment, it turned its head slightly, gave a low flick of its tail, and slipped back into the trees, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. I stood there for a good minute, breathing hard, staring at the spot where it had been. The woods felt unnervingly empty now, but not in a peaceful way. More like something had pressed pause on the world until the predator was gone. Even the birds had gone quiet. I covered the hole with dirt, my hands clumsy with adrenaline, and walked back to camp with every sense on high alert. Every sound, every shadow made me twitch. I knew enough about mountain lions to understand the danger. If you see one, especially that close, it's not by accident. They usually see you long before you see them, and if they let themselves be visible, it means they're either curious or they're deciding what you are. Neither option is comforting. Back at camp, I sat on a log with my pistol across my lap, trying to calm down. My stomach still felt tight, my muscles wired. It took hours before the edge wore off. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those golden eyes staring back. I skipped lunch, too wound up to eat, and debated whether I should pack up and leave early. But something stubborn in me didn't want to run from the woods. I had my gun, I had a fire, and I told myself the cat had probably moved on. The second night was harder. Every snap of a twig in the dark, every rustle of leaves had me gripping the pistol, eyes wide open inside the tent. At one point, just past midnight, I heard what sounded like a low cough, the kind cats make, drifting through the trees. My blood ran cold, and I stayed awake until the sky turned gray with dawn. By the time morning came, I'd made my decision. I boiled water for coffee, packed my camp as quickly as I could, and started down the trail. The hike out felt longer than the hike in, every step carrying the weight of unease. I didn't see the cat again, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. Mountain lions are ghosts in the woods. You see them once, and they can shadow you for miles without another sound. When I finally reached the trailhead and the safety of my truck, I let out a shaky laugh that was more relief than humor. I climbed inside, locked the doors out of pure instinct, and sat there for a long time, staring at the empty trail. That trip taught me something I never fully understood until then. Out in the wild, there are moments when nature strips you of every ounce of control and reminds you exactly where you stand in the food chain. For me, it just happened to be the worst possible moment, crouched and defenseless, staring down one of the most efficient predators in North America. And as much as I can laugh now about how fast fear pushed me to finish, I know deep down how close I might have come to not walking out of those woods at all. I've always liked camping alone. People think it's strange, maybe even reckless, but for me there's a certain calm that comes with being away from everything. No cars, no phones buzzing, no endless chatter. Just the quiet hum of nature. It's not about proving anything. It's just the one place I feel settled. One weekend, I packed up and headed to a forested area I had only been through once before on a short day hike. I remembered how quiet it had felt even during the day, with thick trees and trails that seemed to go on forever without another person in sight. It was the kind of place that made you feel small, and I liked that. This time, I wanted to camp overnight, deeper in, away from the trailhead where families usually parked and wandered a mile or so before turning back. The drive was uneventful, a mix of highways and back roads until the pavement narrowed into cracked asphalt that ended at a gravel lot. I parked, signed the register in the box at the edge of the lot, shouldered my pack, and started hiking in. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the ground was soft from a recent rain. The trail wound between tall pines, and after a couple of miles, I cut off onto a narrower path that led deeper into the woods. I didn't see another person the whole time. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing just far enough off the trail to feel hidden but open enough to pitch my tent. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up smoothly, and I laid out my sleeping bag inside before gathering firewood from the surrounding area. By the time the sun had started slipping lower, I had a fire going and water boiling for a simple meal. As I sat on a log eating, I noticed how the forest seemed to change. During the day, it had felt welcoming, almost serene, but as the shadows stretched and the trees darkened, it felt heavier. The air cooled quickly, and every sound seemed sharper. The snap of a twig, the rush of wind through the branches, even the crackle of my fire. I reminded myself this was normal, just my senses heightening in the quiet. The first odd thing happened after dark. I had hung my food bag in a tree away from camp, high and far enough to discourage animals, and was leaning back against my pack near the fire. The night was so still that when I heard a faint rustling, it cut through everything. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or squirrel nosing around, but when I turned my head, I caught a glimpse of movement just at the edge of the firelight. It was low to the ground, and it moved quickly, then stopped. I squinted, trying to see more, but the darkness swallowed it. My hand went to the knife strapped on my belt, not because I thought I'd need it, but because I felt better knowing it was there. I tossed a small stick into the fire, which flared brighter, but whatever it was had already slipped away. I told myself it was nothing. Animals are everywhere out there. They pass by, curious, and then vanish again. Still, I found myself glancing around the tree line every few minutes as I cleaned up and got ready to turn in. Inside the tent, zipped up and stretched out in my bag, I listened. It's always hardest the first night in a new spot. Every sound feels louder, and the silence between those sounds feels even heavier. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep until I was jolted awake by another noise. This time, a clear scraping sound close to the tent. I froze. It wasn't the scurry of a small animal. It was slower, heavier, like something dragging along the ground. My heart hammered, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The scraping stopped, then there was a faint crunch of leaves. Something was moving around my camp. I slid my hand inside my bag and gripped the handle of my flashlight. I didn't want to shine it unless I had to, because light can make things worse. It tells whatever's out there exactly where you are. I lay there, waiting, listening to the faint shifting and crunching until it faded into silence again. When I finally drifted back to sleep, it was uneasy and shallow. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and scanned the clearing. First, everything looked normal. Then I noticed my firewood pile was scattered. Pieces were dragged a few feet from where I'd stacked them neatly. My pack, which I had leaned against a tree, was tipped over, though nothing seemed missing. The strangest part was the marks in the dirt near the fire pit. Long, uneven lines as if someone or something had scraped sticks across the ground. I tried to reason through it. Maybe an animal had nosed around the camp, tugging at things, pushing my pack over. The marks could have been from branches being dragged by wind or a raccoon pulling at something. I didn't fully believe it, but I didn't want to think about any other explanation. I cooked breakfast, packed a small bag, and decided to do some day hiking to take my mind off it. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, moving at a steady pace. The trees thickened, the ground rose and fell with the terrain, and the air stayed cool and damp. For hours, I didn't see a single person. But I did feel like I was being watched. Crept in slowly, the way you notice silence in a crowded room. The hair on my arms prickled, and every time I stopped walking, the forest seemed too quiet, not just calm, silent. No birds, no insects, just still air and trees. I turned in a slow circle more than once, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. When I finally made it back to camp late in the afternoon, the relief of seeing my tent still standing was stronger than I expected. I told myself I was overthinking everything, that the woods play tricks on your mind when you're alone. I built the fire higher that night, letting the flames crackle and throw light farther into the clearing. But the unease didn't go away. As I lay in the tent again, the noises returned. Not constant, not even close enough to be clear, but there snaps of twigs, faint rustling, a crunch of leaves. Each time I froze, listening, waiting for it to fade. Hours crawled by that way, in half sleep, until finally, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I found more signs. My food bag, which I had hung high in the tree, was still tied where I left it, but the rope had fresh scratches. The bark of the tree had marks too, like something had clawed at it, trying to climb. Again, it could have been an animal, but the size of the marks didn't look right. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I gathered more wood, boiled water, and sat near the fire most of the afternoon. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost constant. Every sound put me on edge. A branch snapping somewhere behind me made me spin so fast I nearly tripped. Nothing was there. By evening, I decided I'd had enough. I camped alone dozens of times before, but something about this place didn't feel right. It wasn't just nerves or animals nosing around. It was heavier than that, like the forest itself was pressing in. I packed what I could that night, leaving only what I'd need to take down the tent in the morning. Sleep was almost impossible. I lay there with my flashlight in one hand, my knife in the other, waiting for the noises to start again. And they did, scraping, crunching, faint shifting just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I never once unzipped it to look. By dawn, I was done. I broke down camp in record time, stuffing everything into my pack and heading straight for the trail. My nerves were frayed, every sound making me whip my head around. I didn't stop for water, didn't stop for food, just kept moving until the trees thinned and the gravel lot came into view. When I reached my car and dropped my pack into the trunk, the relief was overwhelming. The forest was quiet behind me, but I didn't look back as I got in and started the engine. I never went back to that spot again. I've camped plenty of times since, but that trip left me with something I can't shake. I still don't know what was out there. Maybe just animals, maybe nothing at all. But I know how it felt, and the feeling was enough, because out there, miles from anyone, with only a thin sheet of fabric between you and the dark, even the smallest sound can remind you how vulnerable you really are. When I think back on the trip now, I almost laugh at how casually it started. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a few quiet days alone in the woods, away from work, away from people, away from the noise. I had been craving that kind of isolation for months. The stress of daily life had been piling up. Endless emails, constant phone calls, and an apartment that felt smaller and smaller every time I came home. I wanted space, quiet, and the kind of stillness you can only get out where roads fade into dirt and you stop hearing anything man-made except your own boots. That's how I ended up here, And when I say here, I mean here in this exact place in the middle of nowhere, where I now sit trying to steady myself after everything that happened. Well, that's where I am now, so thank you. I had picked a national forest a few hours north of where I lived. Nothing too exotic, but remote enough that I knew I wouldn't run into many people. It wasn't a marked campground with bathrooms and designated fire pits either. It was dispersed camping, which meant I could find my own little patch of forest and set up anywhere as long as I followed the rules. That was what I wanted. Not tents lined up side by side, not families blasting music over campfires, just me and the trees. The first day went smoothly. I drove until the road turned into gravel, then parked at a pull-off that looked like it hadn't been used much recently. From there, I shouldered my pack and started down a faint trail. The trail wasn't maintained, but it was clear enough that I could follow it without bushwhacking. I walked about 2 miles in before deciding on a spot to camp, close to a small creek for water, tucked back just enough from the path that no one would see me unless they wandered off intentionally. It was perfect. I set up camp slowly, savoring the little routines. Staking out my tent on a flat patch of ground, hanging my food bag on a branch high enough that bears wouldn't reach it, collecting fallen wood for a small fire. By late afternoon, I was sitting by the creek with my boots off, soaking my sore feet in the cold water. Everything was as I hoped it would be. Peaceful, silent except for birds, and the smell of pine hanging in the air. That night, I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal. I watched the sky darken through the canopy and felt that strange mix of excitement and nervousness that comes when you're truly alone in the woods. Every sound feels louder. Every crack of a branch makes you pause. I reminded myself that this was exactly why I had come, to reset, to feel small, to feel away from everything. The first night was uneventful. I woke a few times to sounds outside the tent. Something rustling, maybe a deer, but nothing that set off real alarm. By sunrise, I felt rested and eager to explore. The second day, I hiked further down the faint trail, leaving my camp set up since I planned to stay there for 3 nights. I didn't see anyone, not a soul. No footprints on the trail that looked fresh, no tire marks on the road where I had parked. I had the whole place to myself. That night, though, things started to shift. It was after dark, and I had already doused my fire and crawled into the tent. I was lying there with my sleeping bag zipped up, scrolling through some photos on my phone, when I heard it. At first it was faint, almost like fabric brushing against bark. Then it became clearer, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough that I could tell it wasn't a rabbit or raccoon. I froze, holding my breath. The steps weren't coming directly toward my tent. They circled, faintly crunching through leaves, sometimes pausing as if whoever or whatever it was stopping to listen. My pulse hammered in my ears. I reminded myself that I was out here alone. There shouldn't be anyone. I had hiked far enough in, and the trail was faint enough that the odds of someone just happening upon my camp felt impossibly low. Still, the footsteps continued. I reached for the hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag. My hand wrapped around the handle, sweaty, gripping it so tightly my knuckles hurt. For 10 minutes or more, the noises circled. A slow loop, then silence. Eventually, after what felt like forever, everything stopped. No more movement, just the usual night sounds. The creek flowing softly in the distance, the occasional chirp of an insect. I didn't sleep well after that. Every time I dozed, I jerked awake, certain I had heard something again. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I was relieved in a way I had never been before. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the ground around my tent. That's when I saw them, prints in the soft dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. The size looked like an adult man's. The tracks circled the tent, stopping in places as if whoever it was had stood there for a while. My stomach dropped. I told myself maybe it was an old print, maybe it had been there before, but I knew that wasn't true. The edges were sharp, crisp, fresh. I spent the day uneasy. I still tried to enjoy the woods, walking the creek, cooking a meal, but every sound made me snap my head up. Every shadow seemed wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going later than I normally would, sitting awake with the hatchet in my lap. listening. By midnight, I was exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to climb inside the tent. Something about being zipped into thin nylon with no vision of the outside felt unbearable. Around 1 a.m, I heard it again. The footsteps, this time closer, heavier. I turned off my headlamp and sat in total darkness, eyes straining. The fire had burned down to embers, barely glowing. I heard the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping under weight. Whoever it was, they were standing just beyond where I could see. I gripped the hatchet tighter. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. Minutes stretched on like hours. Then came a sound that chilled me more than anything. The slow, drawn-out inhale of breath. Not mine, not an animal's panting. Person. I knew then, without a doubt, that someone was out there. I don't know how long it lasted. Eventually, the sounds faded, footsteps retreating into the distance. I stayed frozen until the sky started to lighten, every muscle locked in tension. When I finally stepped out in the morning, I saw more tracks, fresh again. Whoever it was had walked right up to the edge of my camp, within 15 feet of where I sat in the dark. That was enough. I packed quickly, shoving everything haphazardly into my pack. My plan was to hike straight back to the car and leave. But as I slung the bag over my shoulders, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The prints didn't come from the trail. They came from the direction of the creek, looping around and disappearing back into the trees. Whoever it was hadn't just stumbled on me. They were moving through the woods quietly, off-trail, watching. The hike out was the longest 2 miles of my life. Every step, I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone following. The forest felt different now, not peaceful, but hostile. Every rustle, every crack made me jump. When I reached the car, I felt a rush of relief. I tossed my pack into the back seat, slid behind the wheel, and locked the doors immediately. Only then did I let myself breathe. I drove away without looking back. It's been days since then, and I still don't feel settled. I keep thinking about those bare footprints, circling my tent, standing close enough to hear me breathe. I keep thinking about the slow inhale, the sound of someone savoring the fact that they weren't alone out there, that I was there, vulnerable, unaware until it was almost too late. And now, sitting here, writing this down, I realize the truth that unnerves me most. I wanted to be away from people. I wanted solitude, but solitude in the woods isn't empty. It isn't safe. Sometimes it means being face to face with the kind of presence you can't explain, one that doesn't want to be seen, one that lingers at the edge of firelight. Well, that's where I am now, so thank you. Alone, unsettled, carrying the weight of knowing I wasn't as alone as I thought. And I don't think I'll ever set up a tent in the woods without wondering if someone's out there again, barefoot, waiting in the dark. When I think back on that trip to Washington, it doesn't feel like the kind of story you tell around a fire for laughs. It started that way, sure, with something as small as a squirrel, but the longer I sat out there and the darker the woods got, the less funny it seemed. At first it was just something curious, even a little silly, but being in those deep, wet forests surrounded by old-growth trees, you realize how easily something small can take control of your nerves. That's how it unfolded for me. We had driven up into Washington in early summer, when the mornings were still cool and mist hung in the valleys, clinging to the moss and cedar. I had been to a lot of campsites before, some of them in open desert, some near lakes, some deep in mountains, but nothing felt quite as closed in as those Pacific Northwest forests. The trees shot straight up like columns, thick trunks covered in lichen, and their branches reached so high above that even during the day, the ground stayed in shadow. Every sound echoed differently there. A snapped twig wasn't just a sharp break. It carried down the slope, bouncing between trunks, until you weren't sure how far away it had really happened. The campsite we picked wasn't crowded, which I liked. There were maybe 3 or 4 other vehicles in the whole loop, and they were spread out far enough that it felt like we had the place mostly to ourselves. We pitched our tent near a stand of fir trees, parked the car close by, and set up the basics. The ground was damp but firm, with pine needles thick like a carpet. It smelled like earth and sap. For a while, everything felt good. We cooked, walked around the nearby trails, and listened to the creek running about a quarter-mile off. The first odd thing happened late that first afternoon. I was sitting by the picnic table, trying to dry a pan in the sun, when something clattered off the roof of the car. At first I thought it was just a small branch falling, but then another came down, harder, bouncing right off the hood with a loud ping. I looked up, and at first didn't see anything but branches. Then I spotted movement high above in the thick limbs of one of the firs. A squirrel, gray and fast, darted along the branches, tail flicking back and forth. I laughed under my breath. It didn't seem threatening, just a squirrel being a squirrel. I'd seen them chitter and drop things before. But then another pine cone came down, this one hitting the ground only a few feet from me. Then a stick, snapped off from somewhere above, came tumbling down and landed right beside the fire ring. It was too frequent to be random. I realized the squirrel wasn't just up there running around, it was throwing things. It's hard to explain the feeling that gave me. At first, it was amusement. The idea of this little animal deciding to pelt the car like it was angry we had parked there seemed ridiculous. But after 10 minutes of constant thumps, clacks, and snaps, the sound wore on me. It wasn't just dropping pine cones, it was aiming. The hits were concentrated, not scattered. The car took several more, and then a stick cracked against the picnic table where my elbow had been resting a second before. I remember sitting still, looking up into that thick tangle of branches, and feeling something shift in my chest. I had seen squirrels up close plenty of times, sometimes even stealing food, but this one wasn't coming close for scraps. It was keeping its distance, staying hidden most of the time, and raining things down with a kind of precision that unsettled me. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, I was uneasy. The shadows grew long and the air cooled quickly. Every sound in the forest carried differently as dusk settled in. The squirrel seemed to quiet down then, disappearing into the treetops. I thought maybe it had given up or gone to another part of the woods. But just before full dark, another stick came whistling down and hit the car roof with a loud bang. Startled me bad. I had been getting ready to crawl into the tent, and the sound echoed in the silence of the campground. I waited, looking up, but the canopy was almost invisible against the dimming sky. The branches shifted here and there, but I couldn't see movement clear enough to tell if it was wind or animal. Lying in the tent that night, I kept thinking about it. The woods around were noisy with the usual night sounds. Owls, small rustles, the distant water. But now every snap of a twig made me wonder if it was another cone being picked up, another stick getting dragged into position. I told myself it was just a squirrel and squirrels weren't dangerous, but it didn't help me sleep much. The idea of something small but persistent hovering around camp made me feel exposed. The next morning, I found more pine cones scattered across the hood of the car. They hadn't been there the night before. Some of them had cracked and left sap streaks down the windshield. It looked deliberate. That day, we tried to distract ourselves with hiking. The trails were damp and muddy in places, winding between massive trunks where ferns grew chest-high. It was beautiful, but the entire time I had the feeling of being watched. Every time a squirrel chattered from above, my chest tightened. When we came back to camp that afternoon, the attack started again. This time, more aggressive. Pine cones came down in pairs, hitting the tent and bouncing off the top of the cooler. Sticks landed near the fire ring, one after another. I walked around, craning my neck, but could only catch glimpses of gray darting along the branches. It was fast and always just out of reach. What unsettled me the most wasn't the noise or the mess. It was how targeted it felt. This wasn't random debris falling from above. It followed us. When I moved toward the car, that's where things landed. When I walked back to the table, a stick clattered down beside it. It was as if the animal had drawn boundaries and was determined to enforce them. By evening, I was jumpy and tense. Every sound from above made me flinch. When the wind shook loose natural debris, I found myself bracing, waiting to see if it was another strike. Cooking dinner under that pressure was exhausting. I kept glancing at the treetops, half expecting something heavier to come down. As night fell again, I thought about packing up and leaving early, but it was dark already, and driving those narrow roads at night didn't feel safe either. So I decided to wait it out until morning. That night was worse. The sounds didn't stop. Small thumps on the tent, little scrapes, the occasional sharp crack of something heavier hitting the ground nearby. It wasn't constant, but it was spaced just enough to keep me awake, keep my body on edge. Lying there in the dark, every nerve in me felt raw. It was such a strange thing to be afraid of. A squirrel, but the relentlessness of it wore me down. The final straw came just before dawn. I had finally drifted into shallow sleep when something hit the tent hard, right above my head. It wasn't huge, but it landed with enough force to shake dust and needles down inside. My heart pounded as I sat up in the dim light. I listened. Above the tent, I heard faint scrabbling, the sound of claws on fabric, before it darted away. That was it. I got out as the first gray light was filtering into the trees and started breaking down camp. My hands shook with adrenaline. I shoved gear into bags, didn't bother folding anything properly, just wanted it done. More pine cones came down while I worked, thudding against the car roof, bouncing near my feet. I didn't look up anymore. I just worked faster. By the time the sun had climbed a little higher, I was packed and pulling out of the campsite. As I drove down the gravel road, I looked back once. Up in the treetops, high above the site we had just left, I caught a quick flicker of gray movement. A tail flicked once, and then disappeared into the branches. It was only a squirrel. I kept telling myself that the whole way home. Just a small animal, not a cougar, not a bear, nothing truly dangerous. But the memory of it stuck with me stronger than some encounters with bigger wildlife. The way it had felt intentional, the way it never let up, the way it turned something as simple as camping into a slow grind of nerves. I couldn't shake it. I've camped plenty of times since then, but whenever I hear something skitter in the trees above, I tense up. I watch the branches closer than I should, because now I know that sometimes it isn't just random noise. Sometimes something small, something you'd never think of as dangerous, decides it doesn't want you there. And when it makes that decision, it can change the whole trip. That was the last time I camped in that part of Washington. I still think about it every now and then, especially when I'm lying awake in a tent, waiting for sleep, listening to the branches shift overhead. I've spent a lot of nights outside, in the woods and desert, in tents and under the stars. I've dealt with the usual fears most people have when they camp far from home. Bears, snakes, coyotes, bad weather, even the nagging thought of being so far from help if something goes wrong. But nothing in the wild has ever shaken me the way that night in Arizona did. And worse yet, how it followed me a year later when I thought I was brave enough to return. It started with a simple group trip. A handful of us had decided to head out deep into the middle of nowhere, south of Tucson, Arizona. We wanted distance, no cell service, no noise from highways, just us, the desert, and the stars. The place we chose wasn't even an established campground. It was more like a clearing off a rough dirt road, a place people had used before because there were old fire rings scattered around, but otherwise it was about as remote as you could get without four-wheel drive. We had 2 trucks and an SUV between us, loaded with gear, tents, coolers, and firewood. The first day was the usual excitement of setting up camp, building a fire, laughing too loud, and cooking over the flames as the sun went down. The desert air cooled fast after dark. The stars came out sharp and clear above us, and for a while it was exactly the trip we wanted. That night, though, I woke up to a sound that didn't fit with the quiet. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling outside, the kind of thing you could easily ignore and chalk up to wind. But it wasn't windy. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon wall of the tent, listening harder. The sound came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate sniffing right up against the side of the tent. The kind of noise you'd hear when a dog presses its nose to something and breathes in deep. My immediate thought was a bear, even though bears aren't as common there as in other parts of the country. But coyotes? Mountain lions? Javelina? Any of those could wander into camp if we'd left food out. That's when another thought hit me. Had anyone actually tied up the garbage? I knew how careless some of my friends could be. I imagined bags of trash ripped open on the ground, food smeared everywhere. The perfect invitation for something wild. The sniffing moved along the side of the tent. I held my breath, frozen, straining to hear. The steps weren't heavy, more like soft crunches of shoes or paws on dirt. Then the sound drifted away, and I thought maybe it had lost interest. But seconds later, I realized it hadn't gone far. It had just moved to the tent next to ours. I could hear it again, sniffing along the base of the fabric, slow and steady. Inside my tent, I could tell everyone else was awake too. No one moved, no one spoke, but I felt hands grabbing onto me in the dark, just to let each other know we were all listening to the same thing, all aware of what was happening outside. That silence stretched, broken only by that awful sniffing sound as it circled through our little camp. Then, without warning, one of our friends in another tent unzipped his door and burst out, yelling at the top of his lungs, stomping, clapping, trying to scare off whatever was there. I heard the noise of his boots on the dirt, and the tension broke into chaos for a second. What I expected was the sound of something crashing off into the brush, the kind of retreat you get from an animal startled by loud noise. But that's not what happened. Instead, everything froze, and then it became horrifyingly clear that it wasn't an animal at all. In the light from the fire's dying embers, I caught the shape of a man. Some guy, crouched near one of our coolers, his hands rifling through food. Worse than that, it dawned on me he had been the one sniffing around our tents, pressing his face against the thin walls where we slept. My stomach dropped in a way that no animal encounter could have managed. At least with an animal, you know the rules. Scare it, give it distance, let it leave. But a person doing that in the middle of nowhere, someone choosing to creep around strangers' tents in the dark, that was a different kind of danger altogether. Our friend with the gun chased him, shouting and threatening, and the man bolted into the darkness. None of us saw where he went. That was almost worse than if we had. He could have been hiding just out of sight, waiting, watching. The rest of us scrambled to tear down camp in record time, shoving sleeping bags into cars, grabbing half-burned logs, not caring what we left behind. Within minutes, we were driving away, dust rising behind us as our headlights cut through the night. We didn't stop until we hit pavement again, hours later. No one talked much in those moments. We were all replaying it in our heads, the way you replay the near miss of a car accident, realizing just how close you were to something going horribly wrong. You'd think that would have been enough to keep us from ever going back. And for a while it was. But a year later, we convinced ourselves it had been a fluke. Just some drifter who happened to stumble into our camp. Couldn't happen twice, we thought. Not in the same place. So we went back. This time we thought we were smart about it. We ditched the tents, thinking that maybe being spread out in little fabric cells had made us vulnerable. Instead, we decided to sleep in the backs of our trucks and SUVs. Parked in a loose circle around the fire pit, it felt safer, like the vehicles gave us walls, height, and protection. We joked about how no one could sneak up to sniff a Toyota Tacoma, laughing at our own paranoia as the sun went down. I fell asleep in the back of my SUV, stretched out beside my girlfriend. The desert was calm again, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the last people left in the world. I don't know how long I slept before it happened. The first thing I noticed wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a bright light against my face. My eyelids glowed red from it, like a flashlight beam cutting straight through. For a split second, I almost sat up and cursed at whoever was messing with me. But something deep inside stopped me cold. Instinct. I knew without a doubt that if I moved, if I gave away that I was awake, it wouldn't end well. So I stayed perfectly still, breathing slow, pretending to be asleep. Beside me, my girlfriend shifted slightly, but she didn't sit up either. I hoped she understood the same thing I did. Don't react, don't let him know. The light lingered, sweeping over me, then moved away. I heard footsteps crunching lightly on the dirt. My ears strained in the silence. Then the light came again, this time aimed into the truck bed next to us, where two of our friends were laid out. The beam moved slow, deliberate, like whoever held it was studying them closely. I risked the tiniest glance, just enough to lift my eyelids a sliver. That's when I saw him, an older man, standing at the edge of our camp, holding a flashlight, not moving fast, not acting startled. just calmly walking from vehicle to vehicle, shining his light on each of us while we slept. I can't explain the fear that ran through me in that moment. An animal wants food. An animal doesn't stare at you while you sleep. But a man out there in the middle of nowhere, no camp of his own, no explanation for why he was there, that meant intent. That meant danger we couldn't measure. The beam eventually moved away, drifting toward the dark, and his footsteps faded with it. I waited as long as I could, my heart pounding, until I couldn't stand it anymore. I slid quietly out of the SUV, every muscle shaking, and rushed to wake the others. To my shock, most of them were already awake too, pretending the same way I had been. They'd seen it, felt it. We hadn't said a word, but we all knew exactly what was going on. This time, we didn't waste a second. We piled into vehicles, started engines, and tore out of there before the man could circle back. We drove until the eastern horizon started to glow with morning light, the desert stretching endless and empty around us. That was the last time I camped near Tucson. It's been years now, but I can still feel it. The sound of sniffing outside thin tent walls, the glow of a flashlight on my face, the knowledge that someone had been that close to me while I slept. Coyotes, bears, even mountain lions, those I can handle. But the thought of a stranger wandering the desert at night, choosing to creep into campsites, choosing to stare at sleeping people, that's the kind of thing you don't forget. And the ending was clear to me after those 2 trips. You can prepare all you want for the wild. You can bring guns, lock your food, set up campfires, and build walls of trucks. But none of it matters if the thing you need to fear isn't wild at all. It's human. And out there, in the middle of nowhere, there's no rule that says they can't come back.